The broadcast came through on every available frequency, cutting through the silence of deep space like a scalpel through flesh. Captain David Reeves sat in the command chair of the survey vessel Prometheus, watching the holographic display flicker to life with a message that made his blood run cold. It was a distress signal, but not like any he'd encountered in his 23 years navigating the outer colonies. This one was old, ancient, actually, transmitted from a place that had been declared forbidden territory for over 2 centuries, Earth. The message itself was garbled, broken by centuries of interference and the electromagnetic chaos that surrounded the Sol system like a shroud. But 3 words came through with crystal clarity, repeated over and over in a loop that must have been broadcasting since before David's great-grandfather was born. Do not approach, do not approach, do not approach. David had heard the stories. Of course, every human born in the colonies had Earth as the graveyard world, the place where humanity had begun and nearly ended. When the Great Migration happened in 2287, 97% of Earth's population had fled to the stars, escaping a dying world that had been ravaged by war, disease, and environmental collapse. Those who remained, either too stubborn, too poor, or too foolish to leave, were written off as lost. The Colonial Assembly had declared Earth quarantined, off limits to all travel. Ships that ignored the warning never came back. In 238 years, 47 expeditions had been sent to Earth. 47 ships carrying some of the best and brightest the colonies had to offer. Scientists, soldiers, diplomats, explorers, all of them vanished without a trace. No distress signals, no debris fields, no survivors, just silence, as absolute and final as death itself. The official story was that Earth had become uninhabitable. That whatever had caused the collapse had evolved into something even more catastrophic. Environmental toxins, biological weapons gone wrong, rogue artificial intelligence. The theories were endless and equally terrifying. But David had always suspected there was more to it. The Colonial Assembly wasn't known for being sentimental, but they guarded the truth about Earth with a fanaticism that bordered on religious fervor. Anyone who dug too deep into the old records found themselves reassigned to mining operations in the Outer Rim, or worse. Now, David was being given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Admiral Patricia Hriss had contacted him personally, her face stern and unyielding on his private comm screen. Reeves, you're the closest ship to the Sol system. That distress signal is new, transmitted within the last 72 hours. Something on Earth is still alive, and it's calling for help. The Assembly wants answers. You're going to get them. David had tried to protest. Admiral, with all due respect, 47 expeditions have gone dark. What makes you think we'll be any different? Brix's expression hadn't changed. Because you're not going to make the same mistakes they did. You'll have full military support, cutting-edge defensive systems, and a mandate to retreat at the first sign of trouble. But make no mistake, Captain, this isn't a request. It's an order. You have 48 hours to prepare. Hurl out. Now, 3 weeks later, David stood on the observation deck of the Prometheus, staring at the planet that hung in the viewport like a blue-green jewel shrouded in gray clouds. Earth looked beautiful from this distance, almost peaceful. The storms that raged across its surface were visible only as swirling patterns of white and gray, and the ocean still held that deep azure color that poets had written about for millennia. But David knew better than to trust appearances. Beauty could hide horror. Peace could mask violence waiting to explode. His crew was small, just 15 people, all volunteers who knew the risks. There was Dr. Rachel Kimura, the xenobiologist who specialized in extreme environments and evolutionary adaptation. She was brilliant, but reckless, the kind of scientist who would stick her hand into a nest of acid-spitting insects just to see what happened. Lieutenant James Torreon was his second in command, a veteran of the frontier wars who had seen more combat than anyone his age should have. Torren was steady, reliable, and completely fearless, which David found both reassuring and deeply concerning. The rest of the crew were specialists, engineers, pilots, medical staff, security personnel. All of them were good at their jobs. All of them had been briefed on the 47 failed expeditions, and all of them had volunteered anyway, driven by curiosity, duty, or some combination of the two that David couldn't quite understand. He turned away from the viewport and made his way back to the bridge, his boots clicking against the metal deck plates with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. The bridge was a hive of activity, crew members moving between stations and calling out status reports in clipped, efficient tones. The Prometheus was a Vanguard-class survey vessel designed for long-range exploration and equipped with enough firepower to discourage pirates and hostile alien encounters. It was one of the best ships in the colonial fleet, but David couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. Torin looked up from his station as David entered. "All systems green, Captain. We're ready to begin descent whenever you give the word." His voice was calm, professional, but David could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers hovered over the weapons controls like a gunslinger ready to draw. David settled into the command chair and pulled up the mission parameters on his display. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Enter Earth's atmosphere, locate the source of the distress signal, investigate, and extract. They would maintain constant communication with the Colonial Assembly, transmitting data in real time so that even if something went wrong, the information would survive. It was a sound strategy, one that should have been implemented on the previous expeditions, except it hadn't been. David had spent hours poring over the fragmented records of those lost missions, trying to piece together what had happened. What he'd found was disturbing. Every single expedition had maintained normal communications right up until they entered Earth's atmosphere. Then, without warning or explanation, they simply stopped transmitting. No distress calls, no emergency beacons, just silence. The Colonial Assembly claimed it was electromagnetic interference, some kind of natural phenomenon that disrupted communications. But David had run the numbers, consulted with the best engineers in the fleet, and the explanation didn't hold up. Modern communication systems were designed to punch through interference that would fry unshielded electronics. Something else was happening down there. Something that didn't want the outside universe to know what was going on. Captain Torian was looking at him, waiting for orders. The entire bridge crew had gone silent. All eyes turned towards the command chair. David took a breath, feeling the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. 47 expeditions, hundreds of people who had never come home, families that had never gotten closure, questions that had never been answered. He thought about his own family, his wife Anna and their son Thomas, safe in the colonies. He'd recorded a message for them before leaving, just in case. The standard goodbye that every spacer recorded before a dangerous mission, full of platitudes about doing his duty and how much he loved them. It felt inadequate now, hollow words that could never capture what he really wanted to say. But there was no more time for doubt or second-guessing. The moment had come. "Begin descent," David ordered, his voice steady, despite the fear coiling in his gut. "All hands to stations. Activate full defensive protocols and keep your eyes open. If something moves down there, I want to know about it immediately." The Prometheus shuddered as the engines engaged, pushing them out of orbit and toward the planet below. David watched the viewport as Earth grew larger, filling his vision with clouds and continents and the vast, dark oceans that had once teemed with life. Somewhere down there, in the ruins of humanity's birthplace, something was waiting. Something that had swallowed 47 expeditions without a trace, and David was about to find out what it was. The descent through Earth's atmosphere was rougher than David had anticipated. The Prometheus bucked and shuddered as it hit pockets of turbulence, the hull groaning under stress that shouldn't have been there. Dr. Kimura had warned him that Earth's atmospheric composition had changed significantly since the migration, but the readings coming through now were beyond anything they'd predicted. Oxygen levels were higher, much higher, sitting at nearly 30% compared to the historical 21. Nitrogen was down, and there were trace elements that didn't match any known atmospheric profile. "Captain, I'm getting some weird readings here," called out even Patricia Wolf from the sensor station. She was young, barely 25, with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. "The electromagnetic interference we were briefed about, it's not natural. This is organized, patterned, almost like she paused, her fingers flying across her console. Sir, This reads like a jamming field. Someone down there is actively blocking communications. David felt his jaw tighten. Can you punch through it? Wolf shook her head. Not with our current configuration. I'd need to boost power to the communications array by at least 300%. And even then, I can't guarantee. Do it, David interrupted. I want a live feedback to Colonial Command. Whatever happens to us, they need to see it. Torin turned in his seat, concern etched across his weathered face. If we divert that much power to comms, we'll be pulling from defensive systems. We'd be vulnerable. We're already vulnerable, David said flatly. But if we don't make it back, at least our data will. Do it, NN. The ship dropped through the cloud layer, and suddenly Earth spread out beneath them in all its terrible beauty. David had studied historical images of the planet, seen the sprawling cities and geometric farmland that had once covered vast swaths of the continents. He'd expected to see ruins, the skeletal remains of humanity's first civilization slowly being reclaimed by nature. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. The cities were still there, but they weren't ruins. From this altitude, they looked almost intact, towers and buildings rising from the landscape like steel forests. But something was wrong with them. The geometry was off, twisted in ways that hurt to look at. Buildings that should have been rectangular had bulging organic curves. Skyscrapers bent at impossible angles, their surfaces rippling like flesh rather than metal and glass. And between the structures, covering everything like a carpet, was green. Not the gentle green of grass and trees, but something darker, more aggressive. Vegetation had consumed everything, but it moved. David could see it even from here, writhing and pulsing as if breathing. Jesus Christ, Torin whispered. What happened down there? Doctor. Kimura had moved to stand behind the sensor station, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. The oxygen levels, she said quietly. That much oxygen in the atmosphere, it would cause gigantism in plant and animal life. Everything would grow larger, faster, more aggressive. But this, she gestured at the viewport, this isn't just growth. This is something else entirely. The distress signal was coming from what used to be North America, somewhere in the region that had once been called the American Midwest. As they descended further, David could make out more details of the landscape below. Rivers that had changed course, cutting new channels through terrain that looked more like scar tissue than earth. Forests so dense that they appeared black from above, their canopy so thick that no light reached the ground. And everywhere that sense of wrongness, of nature run amok and twisted into something that shouldn't exist. Contact, Lieutenant Hayes shouted from Tactical. I've got movement on the surface. Multiple signatures, large biomass readings. They're tracking us. David leaned forward in his chair. Define large. Hayes's fingers danced across his console, his face pale. Bigger than anything in our database, sir. I'm reading individual organisms at over 300 milliliters in length. There, Captain. They're converging on our trajectory. Evasive maneuvers, David ordered. And somebody tell me what the hell those things are. The Prometheus banked hard to port, engines screaming as the pilot fought to maintain altitude and speed. Through the viewport, David caught glimpses of movement in the green below. Massive shapes that defied easy description. They looked like serpents or perhaps centipedes, their segmented bodies covered in what might have been scales or might have been leaves. They moved with terrifying speed, their bodies undulating across the landscape and leaving trails of disturbed vegetation in their wake. One of them reared up, rising hundreds of meters into the air, and David saw that its head, if it could be called that, was a mass of tentacles or vines, all writhing and reaching toward the ship. For a moment, he had the absurd thought that it was trying to grab them, to pull them out of the sky like a child snatching a toy from the air. Weapons hot, David commanded. If those things get any closer, light them up. Torin's hands were already on the weapons controls. Locked and ready, Captain. Say the word. But the creatures didn't attack. As the Prometheus maintained its evasive course, The massive organism seemed to lose interest, slowly sinking back into the green carpet below. David watched them disappear, feeling a cold sweat on the back of his neck. Those things weren't just big, they were intelligent, or at least aware. They had tracked the ship, moved with purpose. Whatever had happened to Earth, it hadn't just changed the planet. It had created something new. The distress signal is getting stronger, Wolf reported. The source is approximately 40 kilometers ahead in what used to be Kansas City. Sir, I'm also picking up power signatures, electrical systems, possibly fusion reactors. Someone down there has active technology. David felt a spark of hope mixed with dread. Active technology meant survivors. People who had somehow endured 2 centuries in this nightmare world. But it also meant that whatever had happened here, it hadn't killed everyone. Some humans had stayed, adapted, and survived. The question was, what had they become in the process? The ruins of Kansas City emerged from the green like bones from a grave. The distress signal was coming from the center of what had once been the downtown district, now a maze of twisted architecture and aggressive vegetation. David ordered the pilot to set them down on what looked like a stable platform, the roof of a building that had somehow maintained its structural integrity. As the Prometheus touched down with a shudder, David stood and addressed his crew. We're going in small, just 4 people. Torin, Kimura, Hayes, and myself. The rest of you maintain a secure perimeter and keep the engines hot. If we're not back in 2 hours, or if something goes wrong, you lift off immediately and report back to Colonial Command. Understood? The bridge crew nodded, though David could see the fear in their eyes. He didn't blame them. He felt it too. A primal terror that whispered he was making a terrible mistake. But duty demanded he press forward, and so he would. The airlock hissed open, and David got his first taste of Earth's air in over 2 centuries. It was thick, humid, and carried a scent that was both familiar and alien. Flowers and rot, growth and decay, all mixed together in a cocktail that made his head spin. The oxygen was almost intoxicating, making him feel simultaneously energized and lightheaded. They were standing on a rooftop covered in a thin layer of moss and lichen, the surface spongy beneath their boots. The building itself was perhaps 30 stories tall, its walls covered in climbing vines that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence. In the distance, David could hear sounds, rustling, clicking, something that might have been singing or might have been screaming. The city was alive in ways that defied explanation. Life signs ahead, Hayes reported, consulting his handheld scanner. Human, or at least human adjacent. Multiple signatures concentrated in the building directly below us. That's where the distress signal is coming from. They found an access door half covered in vegetation and forced it open, revealing a stairwell that descended into darkness. David clicked on his helmet light, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal stairs covered in a thin layer of what looked like fungus. It glowed faintly in response to the light, pulsing with colors that shifted from blue to green to purple. Stay close, David ordered, drawing his sidearm. And watch your step. We don't know what's safe to touch down here. They descended slowly, the only sounds their breathing and the soft squelch of their boots on the fungus-covered stairs. The walls were covered in more of the bioluminescent growth, creating patterns that almost looked intentional, like writing or art. David tried not to think about what that might mean. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached what looked like an inhabited level. The fungus thinned out here, and David could see signs of human occupation. Furniture that had been repaired and maintained, lighting systems jury-rigged from salvaged technology, and walls that had been cleared and painted with murals depicting scenes that made David's blood run cold. The murals showed people, but not the people who had left Earth during the migration. These humans were changed, adapted. Their bodies were elongated, their skin modeled with patterns that looked like camouflage or perhaps symbiotic organisms. And they weren't alone in the paintings. They were shown living alongside the creatures David had seen from the air, working with them, Or perhaps serving them. It was impossible to tell which. Captain Kimura said softly, pointing to one particular mural. "Look at this." The painting showed a group of humans kneeling before something massive and terrible. A creature that seemed to be part plant, part animal, part something else entirely. Above it, painted in letters that still used the Old English alphabet, were words that made David's hands shake. "We chose to stay. We chose to change. We are home." A voice spoke from the shadows, old and cracked, but still human, "And you should have stayed away." David spun toward the voice, his weapon raised and his heart hammering against his ribs. From the shadows at the far end of the corridor emerged a figure that was human in the way a nightmare is human, recognizable, but fundamentally wrong. The man was tall, easily 7'5", his body thin and elongated like he'd been stretched on a rack. His skin had a greenish tint, mottled with patterns that shifted and moved in the light from David's helmet. But it was his eyes that truly disturbed. They were too large, pupils dilated to the point where almost no white remained, and they reflected the light like an animal. "Don't shoot," the man said, raising his hands in a gesture that was almost pleading. "Please, we called for help. But now, I think it was a mistake." David kept his weapon trained on the figure, but didn't fire. "Who are you? Are you the one who sent the distress signal?" The man nodded slowly, his movements fluid and strange. "My name is Thomas Bridger. I'm the last of the original researchers, the last one who remembers what we were before." He laughed, a sound like wind through hollow reeds, though last is a relative term down here. We're all last something. Dr. Kimura stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "What happened to you? Your physiology? It's been radically altered. This isn't just environmental adaptation. This is wholesale genetic restructuring." Bridger's two large eyes focused on her and he smiled with too many teeth. "Smart. You're right. Of course. It started about 50 years after the migration. Those of us who stayed, we thought we could fix Earth, heal it, make it livable again. We were wrong. Earth didn't need fixing. Earth was evolving, and we were just parasites that needed to be integrated or eliminated." He began walking down the corridor, gesturing for them to follow. David exchanged glances with Torin, who shrugged and kept his own weapon ready. They followed Bridger deeper into the building, passing more murals, more signs of habitation that became increasingly alien the further they went. "The plants came first," Bridger continued, his voice taking on a lecturing quality, as if he'd told this story many times before. "We tried to engineer species that could survive in the toxic environment, break down the pollutants, and restore the atmosphere. We succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Too well. In fact, the plants we created didn't just survive. They thrived. They evolved at rates that should have been impossible, developing characteristics that defied every law of biology we understood." They entered a large chamber that had once been an office building's lobby. Now it was something else entirely. A living space carved from the intersection of human architecture and organic growth. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, and in the center of the room was a garden unlike anything David had ever seen. Plants grew in impossible configurations, their leaves and stems forming geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And moving among them were more people, if they could still be called that, Ald. There were perhaps 20 of them, all showing the same elongated features as Bridger, though some were more changed than others. Some had skin that was more green than flesh-toned. Others had what looked like bark growing from their shoulders and backs. One woman had flowers growing from her hair, their petals opening and closing in rhythm with her breathing. They all stopped what they were doing to stare at the newcomers with those two large, reflective eyes. "These are the changes," Bridger said quietly. "The ones who accepted Earth's gift. The ones who chose to become part of the new ecosystem rather than fight against it." Hayes had his scanner out running readings on everything in sight. "Captain, these people, their DNA is contaminated with plant genetic material, extensive chloroplast integration, cellulose structures in their dermal layers, and photosynthetic capabilities. They're not human anymore. They're hybrids. One of the changes. A young man who couldn't have been more than 20 spoke up. His voice is surprisingly normal. We're more human than we ever were in the colonies. We're home. We belong here in ways you could never understand. David felt anger rising in his chest. You sent a distress signal. You called for help. Why? If you're so content with what you've become. Bridger's expression turned pained. I sent it against the wishes of the collective because I'm old and dying and I wanted someone from outside to know, to understand what really happened here. Why do all those expeditions never return? He moved to a chair and sat down with visible effort, and to warn you, to tell you that you need to leave now before it's too late. Before what's too late? Torrin demanded. What happened to the other expeditions? Bridger was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. They were integrated, just like we were, just like everything that stays on Earth too long. The planet, it's not just alive anymore. It's aware, conscious, and it's hungry for diversity, for new genetic material to incorporate into itself. When those ships came, Earth welcomed them, embraced them, and made them part of the ecosystem. David felt his blood run cold. You're saying the planet itself killed them? Not killed, Bridger corrected. Transformed, changed, made them into something new and better according to Earth's design. The crews didn't die. They joined. They became part of the green, part of the collective. Their ships were broken down for materials. Their technology is integrated into our infrastructure, and they were happy to do it, Captain. Once the spores get into your system, once the integration begins, you want it. You crave it, like an addict craves a fix. Dr. Kimura was staring at her handheld scanner, her face pale. Captain, I'm detecting high concentrations of airborne spores in this environment. They're everywhere. We've been breathing them since we entered the building. David felt a spike of panic. Can our filters handle them? Kimura shook her head slowly. Our suits are designed for standard atmospheric filtration, not biological warfare. These spores are incredibly small, nanoscale. Some of them are already in our bloodstreams. I can detect them in my own readings. How long? David asked, his voice tight. How long until we're like them? Bridger stood up, moving closer with that unsettling fluidity. Depends on the individual. Some people resist for weeks, others embrace the change within days. But everyone changes eventually. Earth doesn't allow rejection. You're part of the ecosystem now, whether you want to be or not. He paused, studying David's face. I sent the distress signal because I hoped that maybe someone could develop a cure, a way to reverse the process. But now that you're here, now that I see the fear in your eyes, I realize I was being selfish. I've condemned you to the same fate as everyone else who came here. David's mind was racing. They needed to get back to the ship, get into quarantine, figure out if there was any way to stop the spores from taking hold. But even as he thought it, he could feel something changing inside him. A warmth spreading through his chest, a tingling in his fingers. It wasn't unpleasant. That was the worst part. It felt good, like waking up after a long sleep, like coming home after years away. We're leaving, David said firmly, grabbing Kimura's arm. Now we'll figure out containment protocols on the ship. But Bridger stepped in front of the door, blocking their exit. Behind him, the other changes had risen from their positions, forming a loose circle around David and his team. Their expressions weren't hostile, but they weren't friendly either. They looked almost pitying. I can't let you leave, Bridger said sadly. Not yet. If you go back to your ship now, you'll spread the spores to the rest of your crew. Within a week, your entire ship will be changed. And if you try to return to the colonies, you'll carry Earth's gift with you. Within a generation, every human settlement in the galaxy would be transformed. Torrin had his weapon up, pointed at Bridger's chest. Get out of our way, or I'll put a hole through you. You could, Bridger acknowledged, but it wouldn't matter. Even if you kill all of us, Even if you make it back to your ship, the spores are already in you. They're already working. The only question is whether you fight it and suffer or accept it and find peace. David could feel the warmth spreading further now, reaching into his limbs, his neck, his head. His vision was becoming sharper, colors more vivid. He could hear sounds he'd never noticed before. The rustle of leaves outside, the breathing of his team members, the pulse of sap moving through the living walls around them. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "There has to be another way," David said desperately. "Some kind of treatment, something to stop this." Bridger shook his head. "We tried everything in the first decades. Antivirals, genetic therapy, radiation treatment. Nothing worked. Earth's integration process is too sophisticated, too deeply embedded in the spore's programming. Once you're infected, you're part of Earth forever." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "But it's not the end, Captain. It's a beginning, a new form of existence. You'll understand soon enough." Hayes suddenly doubled over, gasping. David grabbed him, holding him upright. "What's wrong?" "I can feel it." Hayes choked out. "Inside me, growing, changing." "Oh God, Captain. And I can feel it spreading." Dr. Kimura was running her scanner over Hayes, her hands shaking. "His cellular structure is already beginning to change. The spores are rewriting his DNA at an accelerated rate. His immune system isn't fighting it, it's helping it, treating the spores as beneficial rather than hostile." She looked up at David, tears in her eyes. "We're all infected, all of us. There's no stopping it now." David felt rage boiling up inside him, cutting through the pleasant warmth that was trying to seduce his mind. "You did this deliberately. You lured us here knowing what would happen." "No," Bridger said firmly. "I warned you. I told you to leave, but you came anyway because humans always think they can conquer everything, control everything. You couldn't accept that Earth no longer belongs to you, that it's evolved beyond your comprehension." He gestured to the changes around them. "We're not your enemies, Captain. We're your future, and it's a beautiful future if you'll just let yourself accept it." David's hand went to his sidearm, but Torin grabbed his wrist. "Don't, Captain. Even if we fight our way out, even if we make it back to the ship, we can't risk spreading this to the colonies. We're compromised. The mission is over." "Like hell it is," David snarled. But even as he spoke, he knew Torin was right. They were trapped, not by the changes or by Earth's defenses, but by their own biology. The spores were inside them, rewriting their genetic code, transforming them into something that could no longer be allowed to leave this world. David's mind raced through their options, each one bleaker than the last. They could try to fight their way back to the ship, but they'd only be carrying the infection with them. They could barricade themselves and hope for rescue, but any rescue team would face the same fate. They could try to warn the colonies, but Wolf had said the communications were being jammed. Every path forward led to the same destination: integration into Earth's new ecosystem or death trying to prevent it. "How long do we have?" David asked Bridger, forcing himself to stay calm, to think like a captain rather than a terrified man watching his humanity slip away before the change becomes irreversible. Bridger considered the question, tilting his head in a way that was distinctly inhuman. Irreversible is a strong word. The change is always progressing, always deepening. But if you're asking when you'll lose the ability to think like your old self, to remember what you were, that varies. For me, it took about 3 weeks before I stopped wanting to fight it. Before I understood that resistance was pointless, and acceptance was liberation. "That's not liberation," Torin growled. "That's surrender. That's letting yourself be turned into something else against your will." One of the others changed, spoke up. The woman with flowers in her hair. Her voice was melodic, almost hypnotic. "Is it surrender when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly? Is it lost when a seed becomes a tree? You think of it as death because you fear change. But we're still ourselves. We still remember who we were. We've just become more. David looked at Hayes, who was still doubled over, breathing hard. The young lieutenant's skin was already taking on a greenish tinge, and when he looked up, his eyes were beginning to show that telltale reflective quality. The transformation was happening fast. Too fast. Whatever was in the air here, it was accelerating the process beyond what Bridger had described. The spore concentration in this chamber is higher than normal, Dr. Kimura said, as if reading David's thoughts. She was examining her scanner with a clinical detachment that David found disturbing. Was she already being affected? Was the change making her care less about their predicament? They've concentrated the spores here deliberately. This is an integration chamber. They brought us here to speed up our transformation. Bridger didn't deny it. The longer you resist, the more painful the process becomes. We're being merciful, helping you transition quickly. In a few hours, the worst will be over. You'll see the world differently. You'll understand. Understand? What? David demanded. That humanity gave up. That we let ourselves be conquered by our own planet. Conquered? Bridger laughed. That hollow reed sound again. Captain, we weren't conquered. We evolved. When the migration happened, we thought humanity's future was in the stars. We were wrong. Humanity's future was always here on Earth, but in a form we couldn't have imagined. The people who left, they're the ones who gave up. They ran away rather than face the challenge of adaptation. David felt the warmth in his chest intensifying, spreading like liquid fire through his veins. His senses were becoming overwhelming. He could smell the individual chemical signatures of everyone in the room, could hear the electrical impulses firing in their nervous systems, could almost taste the spores in the air around them. It was too much, too intense, and yet some part of him was rain in it. We need to get a warning out, David said, fighting to maintain focus. Even if we can't save ourselves, we can prevent more ships from coming here. Wolf said the jamming was organized. There has to be a way to break through it. Bridger's expression turned sad. The collective won't allow it. Earth's consciousness. And yes, Captain, the planet is conscious now, aware in ways that would take years to explain. Doesn't want to be alone. It wants diversity, new genetic material, new minds to add to its network. Every ship that comes here is an opportunity for growth, for evolution. The collective will do everything in its power to ensure more ships come, not fewer. Then we destroy the source of the distress signal, Torin said flatly. Cut off the lure. You can try, Bridger said, but there isn't one source. There are hundreds all across the planet. Every settlement of the changed broadcasts the signal, hoping to bring more people home. You'd have to destroy all of us. And even then, the planet itself would find other ways to call out. David's tactical mind was working through the implications. If Earth had truly become a conscious, coordinated entity, then they weren't dealing with a simple biological hazard. They were dealing with an intelligence, possibly a hostile one, that had claimed an entire world and turned it into a trap for any human who came close. The 47 lost expeditions made perfect sense now. They hadn't been destroyed. They'd been absorbed. Their crews integrated into Earth's new ecosystem. Their knowledge and memories added to the collective. What about our ship? David asked. The Prometheus is still up there with 11 crew members. What's to stop them from leaving right now? Bridger walked to a window, gesturing for them to look out. Through the organic growth covering the glass, David could see the building's rooftop where they'd landed. Prometheus was still there, but it wasn't alone. The massive serpentine creatures David had seen from the air had surrounded it, their bodies coiled around the landing site in concentric rings. As he watched, one of them raised its head toward the ship, the massive tentacles at its front, reaching out to brush against the hull. They're called the Guardians, Bridger explained. Part of Earth's immune system in a way. They ensure that nothing leaves without the collective's permission. Your crew is safe for now. The Guardians won't attack unless provoked, but if they try to take off, those creatures will tear your ship apart before it clears the building. Hayes had collapsed to the floor now, his body convulsing. David knelt beside him, helpless to do anything but watch as his officer's skin took on a bark-like texture. As his fingers elongated and thin vines began growing from beneath his nails, the transformation was accelerating, and Hayes was no longer fighting it. His eyes had gone completely reflective, and when he looked at David, there was something alien in his gaze, something ancient and green and utterly inhuman. "It doesn't hurt," Hayes whispered, his voice changing, becoming musical. "Captain, it doesn't hurt at all. It feels like waking up from a bad dream, like remembering something I'd forgotten." He reached up with his changed hand, touching David's face. "You'll see soon. You'll see." David jerked away, feeling bile rise in his throat. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. But even as he thought it, he could feel his own conviction wavering. The warmth in his chest was spreading to his head now, and with it came thoughts that weren't entirely his own. Impressions of vast networks spreading across the planet, of minds connected through roots and spores, and something that might have been telepathy, or might have been something else entirely. He could sense the collective, feel its presence like a weight pressing against his consciousness, inviting him to join, to merge, to become part of something greater than himself. "No," David said aloud, as much to convince himself as anyone else. "No, this isn't right. This isn't human." "You keep using that word," the flower-haired woman said, moving closer. "Human as if it means something fixed and unchangeable. But humans have always been changing. Captain, we evolved from apes, from fish, from single-celled organisms. Change is what we do. This is just the next step. Doctor." Bamura had stopped looking at her scanner. She was staring at her hands, watching as her skin began to show the first signs of change. A faint green tinge, a subtle pattern emerging like camouflage. "The spores are remarkable," she said drily. "They don't just rewrite DNA, they optimize it. They're correcting genetic errors, eliminating disease markers, enhancing sensory capabilities. From a purely scientific standpoint, this is the most sophisticated genetic engineering I've ever encountered." "Rachel," David said sharply, using her first name to try to bring her back. "Don't let it seduce you. Remember who you are. Remember why we came here." She looked at him, and for a moment he saw clarity in her eyes. "I remember David. I remember everything, but I'm also beginning to understand something you don't yet. This isn't death. It isn't even a loss." She paused, searching for words. "It's like being blind your whole life and suddenly being able to see. No, it's more than that. It's like discovering you have senses you never knew existed. I can feel the network now. All the minds connected across the planet. Millions of them, all thinking and dreaming and growing together. It's beautiful." Torrin had his weapon out again, but his hands were shaking. David could see the same greenish tinge starting to appear on his second-in-command skin. They were all changing, all being integrated into Earth's new ecosystem. The question was no longer if they would transform, but how they would respond when the transformation was complete. "There's still a choice," Bridger said softly. "You can fight it, try to resist, and spend your remaining time in agony and fear. Or you can accept it, open yourself to the change, and discover what humanity was always meant to become. Either way, the outcome is the same. But one path leads to peace, and the other to suffering." David looked around the room at Hayes, now more plant than man, his body already beginning to root into the floor. At Kimura, staring at her hands with wonder rather than horror. At Torrens, fighting to stay focused even as his own transformation progressed. At the change who surrounded them, no longer human, but not quite plant either. Something new and strange and terrible. And he could feel it in himself, the change working its way through every cell, every neuron. His thoughts were becoming clearer and stranger at the same time, his perceptions expanding beyond the normal human range. He could sense life all around them, not just the people, but the plants growing through the building, the massive creatures outside, the vast network of roots and fungal connections spreading beneath the entire city. It was overwhelming and intoxicating, and David realized with horror that part of him wanted to surrender to it. "How many?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many people are part of the collective now?" Bridger smiled, and for a moment David saw genuine happiness in his alien features. Everyone who stayed on Earth when the migration happened. Everyone who's come back since. Roughly 300 million minds, all connected, all sharing in Earth's consciousness. And we're just the beginning, Captain. This is what the planet wants. To spread, to grow, to connect with all the lost children of humanity scattered across the stars. Earth is calling you home, all of you. David's hand went to the communicator on his belt, a desperate last attempt to warn the ship, to tell them to run while they still could. But when he pressed the button, all he got was static. The jamming was absolute. They were trapped on a living world that wanted to consume them. And the worst part was David was beginning to want it too. The realization hit David like a physical blow. He was losing, not to the changed, not to Bridger or the collective, but to himself. The part of him that wanted to fight, to resist, to remain David Reeves, husband and father and captain, was being drowned out by something else. Something that whispered it would be easier to let go, to accept the transformation, to become part of something larger than his individual existence. He thought of Anna, his wife, the way she smiled when she thought he wasn't looking. The sound of her laugh is like music. Their son Thomas, only 8 years old, wanted to be a starship captain, just like his father. David had recorded that message for them before leaving, full of empty promises about coming home safe. Now he understood that he would never see them again, not as the man they knew. Anyway, that thought ignited something in him, a fury so pure and primal that had burned through the seductive warmth of the spores like acid. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the memory of who he had been, for the people waiting for him in the colonies, for every human who might follow them to Earth if they failed to stop this. "No," David said again, but this time with conviction that surprised even himself. He stood up, pushing away from Hayes's transformed body. "I don't care how beautiful it is. I don't care how much sense it makes from an evolutionary standpoint. This isn't choice. It's infection. It's mind control dressed up as enlightenment." Bridger's expression shifted, showing something that might have been disappointment or might have been pity. "You'll change your mind. They all do eventually. The human mind can only resist for so long before it accepts the inevitable. Then I'll resist until I can't anymore," David said. He turned to Torin. "Lieutenant, are you with me?" Torin's face was a mask of concentration, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought against the transformation taking place inside him. "Always, Captain. What's the play? We get back to the ship. We find a way through that jamming and warn Colonial Command about what's really happening here. And then," David paused, the weight of what he was about to say settling on his shoulders like lead. "And then we make sure no one can ever use us to lure more ships here, even if it means we don't leave this planet alive." "Doctor." Kimura was still staring at her hands, but at David's words, she looked up. There was a struggle visible in her eyes. The scientist, fascinated by the phenomenon, warred with the human who understood what was at stake. "The spores are already in our systems," she said slowly. "Even if we get back to the ship, we'll infect the crew. We're contaminated."
"Then we don't go back to the crew," David said. "We access the ship's systems remotely, lock ourselves in the cargo bay, and figure out how to punch through the jamming from there. The Prometheus has isolation protocols for exactly this kind of scenario." "You're forgetting about the Guardians," Bridger said, his voice taking on an edge. "They won't let you leave. And even if you somehow made it to the ship, even if you managed to seal yourselves away from your crew, the collective has already begun integrating them. Your communications officer, Wolf, wasn't it? She's been breathing higher concentrations of spores every time she's adjusted the communications array. The spore density around electronic equipment is significantly elevated. The collective learned long ago that technology and organic matter work better together." David felt ice in his veins. "You're lying."
Am I? Bridger gestured to a wall where organic growth had merged with what looked like old computer equipment, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that mimicked circuit boards. How do you think we maintain our technology after 200 years? The collective integrates it, maintains it, improves it. Your ship systems have been exposed since the moment you landed. The spores are probably already colonizing your electronics, making subtle changes to your navigation systems, your communications, your life support. David wanted to call it impossible, but he'd seen too much already. If Earth had truly evolved into something conscious and coordinated, then of course it would have learned to interface with technology. The spores weren't just biological agents. They were programmable matter, capable of bridging the gap between organic and synthetic systems. Then we blow the ship, Torin said flatly. Self-destruct. If we can't save ourselves, at least we can deny Earth a functional starship. The changes around them stirred at that, their passive observation shifting into something more alert, more threatening. Bridger stepped forward, his elongated body blocking the exit more deliberately now. The collective won't allow that. You're valuable, Captain. You and your crew represent genetic diversity, knowledge, memories that Earth can learn from. Destroying the ship would be wasteful, and Earth abhors waste. I don't give a damn what Earth abhors, David snarled. He raised his sidearm, pointing it at Bridger. Get out of our way or I'll show you what humans do when we're backed into a corner. But before he could pull the trigger, vines erupted from the floor, wrapping around his legs and arms with impossible speed. They weren't just plants. They moved with purpose and intelligence, responding to the collective's will. David struggled, but the vines only tightened, thorns pressing into his skin without quite breaking through. Around him, Torin and Kimura were similarly restrained, the building itself becoming a prison. We don't want to hurt you, Bridger said, and he sounded genuinely regretful. But we can't let you destroy what you don't understand. Give it time, Captain. Let the transformation complete. You'll see that this isn't the end of humanity. It's the beginning of something greater. David fought against the vines, feeling them dig deeper into his flesh. His blood, when it came, was tinged with green, and he realized with horror that the transformation was already more advanced than he'd thought. How much of him was still human? How much had already been rewritten by Earth's insidious genetic programming? Hayes, now almost completely transformed, dragged himself across the floor toward David. His face was barely recognizable, covered in bark-like growths and sprouting small flowers from his cheeks. But when he spoke, his voice still held a trace of the young officer David had known. Captain, please stop fighting. It's so much better when you stop fighting. I can feel everything now. Every tree, every blade of grass, every mind in the collective. We're all connected, all one. You could be part of this. You could be home. This isn't home, David said through gritted teeth. Home is where my family is. Home is the colonies, where humans can still be human. The colonies, Bridger said softly, are sterile, artificial. Humanity living in metal cans, breathing recycled air, eating synthesized food. Is that really living, Captain? Or is it just existing? Here on Earth, we're part of something real, something alive and growing and eternal. David could feel his resolve weakening. Not because Bridger's arguments were convincing, but because the spores were working deeper into his brain, releasing chemicals that made resistance feel pointless and surrender feel like relief. He could sense the collective now, pressing against his consciousness like an ocean against a dam. It would be so easy to let it in, to stop fighting and just become part of the flow. But then he thought of Thomas again, his 8-year-old son, who loved starships and wanted to explore the galaxy. If David gave up now, if he let Earth consume him, then every ship that came after would face the same fate. The collective would keep calling, keep luring, keep integrating, until eventually it reached the colonies themselves. His son would grow up in a universe where Earth wasn't just a forbidden world. It was an active predator hunting humanity across the stars. That image gave him strength. He stopped struggling against the vines and instead focused inward, trying to understand the spores working inside him. If they were programmable matter, if they could interface with both biological and technological systems, then maybe, just maybe, they could be fought on their own terms. "Rachel," David called out, "you said the spores were optimizing our DNA. That means they're reading it, analyzing it, rewriting it. Can they be hacked?" Dr. Kimura looked at him, confusion and dawning understanding warring on her changed features. "Theoretically, yes, if we could introduce a competing genetic program, something that interfered with their rewriting process, but we'd need laboratory equipment, time, resources we don't have." "What about nanites?" David pressed. "The Prometheus Medical Bay has medical nanites for emergency surgery. They're programmable at the molecular level. Could they interfere with the spores?" Kimura's eyes widened. "Possibly if we could reprogram them to target and disrupt the spore's genetic instructions, but the jamming would prevent us from accessing the ship's medical database remotely. We'd need a direct connection." Bridger was watching their exchange with a growing alarm. "The collective won't let you reach the ship. Even if you escaped this building, the Guardians would stop you, and your own bodies are betraying you. Every second that passes, you become more integrated, more part of Earth. Soon, you won't want to fight anymore." David knew Bridger was right. He could feel the transformation accelerating, feel his thoughts becoming less his own and more part of the vast network of minds that comprised the collective. In an hour, maybe less, he would lose the ability to resist. Whatever he was going to do, it had to be now. Lieutenant David said to Torin, "The plasma charges we brought for breaching, are they still on your belt?" Torin's eyes met his understanding dawning. "Yes, sir. 3 of them. The building structure has been compromised by organic growth," David continued, speaking quickly before the changes could react. "If we detonate the charges at key support points, we could bring this entire section down, creating enough chaos to escape." "You'd kill yourselves," Bridger said. "Kill all of us. Is that really what you want?" David met his gaze steadily. "I want to stop you from luring any more people to this nightmare. If that means dying, then so be it. At least I'll die." The vines around them tightened, thorns now breaking skin, and David gasped in pain. The collective was done being gentle. If they wouldn't submit willingly, they would be restrained until the transformation completed. But the change had made a mistake. They'd assumed that humans would always choose survival over principle. They didn't understand that sometimes the most human thing you could do was fight, even when you knew you couldn't win. David had one advantage left, and it was the most primal weapon humanity had ever possessed: the willingness to destroy everything rather than surrender. The changed might have superior strength, enhanced senses, and the backing of an entire planet's consciousness. But they'd forgotten what desperation looked like. They'd been part of the collective for so long that they no longer understood the savage mathematics of a cornered animal. "Torin," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain of thorns digging into his flesh. "On my mark, deploy charge 1. Kimura, when the vines loosen, run for the stairwell. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. We get to the ship, or we die trying." Bridger moved toward them, his face twisted with something that might have been concern or might have been anger. "Captain, this is madness. You'll accomplish nothing except David didn't let him finish." "Mark." Torin's hand had been inching toward his belt throughout the entire conversation, so slow and subtle that the changed hadn't noticed. Now he grabbed one of the plasma charges and thumbed the activation sequence. The device let out a high-pitched whine as it armed itself, and Torin hurled it across the chamber toward one of the load-bearing pillars that held up the building's ceiling. The changed reacted instantly, the vines releasing their captives as the collective's attention shifted to the threat. David felt the thorns tear free of his skin, leaving bloody gouges that burned with more than just physical pain. But he was already moving, launching himself toward the exit, as the plasma charge detonated with a sound like thunder compressed into a single instant. The explosion tore through the organic-infested pillar, superheated plasma vaporizing plant matter and concrete alike. The ceiling above them groaned, a deep sound that David felt in his bones, and then began to collapse. Chunks of concrete and twisted rebar crashed down along with cascades of burning vegetation that filled the air with acid smoke. David grabbed Kimura's arm and pulled her towards the stairwell. Torrance, right behind them. Behind them, the changes were screaming, not in pain, but in something else. A keening wail that was more emotional than physical. They were feeling the deaths of the plants, experiencing the destruction as if it were happening to their own bodies. The collective was vast, but individual losses still registered as trauma. They hit the stairwell at a dead run, taking the steps 3 at a time. David's enhanced senses, a gift from the very spores he was fighting, allowed him to navigate the darkness easily, seeing in the dim bioluminescence that pulsed along the walls. Behind them, he could hear pursuit. Not just the changes from the integration chamber, but others drawn by the collective's alarm. The building was waking up. Every organism in it mobilized to stop the intruders who had violated its sanctuary. Second charge. David gasped as they reached a landing. The support wall there. Torin didn't question, just armed another plasma charge and placed it against the wall with practiced efficiency. They were already moving again when it detonated. The explosion shaking the entire structure and sending a spiderweb of cracks racing through the organic-infested concrete. They burst onto the rooftop to find chaos. The Guardians, those massive serpentine creatures, had indeed surrounded Prometheus, but the ship's crew had seen the explosions below and understood something was wrong. Floodlights blazed from the ship's hull, illuminating the rooftop in harsh white light that made the creature's scales shine like oil on water. The main engines were already warming up. David could hear the distinctive whine of the fusion reactors cycling to full power. But between them and the ship was a nightmare gauntlet. The Guardians had drawn their bodies tighter, creating a living wall of flesh and scale, and those horrible tentacle clusters that passed for heads. They were swaying, those tentacles reaching toward the ship, and David realized with horror that they were already touching the hull, trying to find purchase, trying to tear their way inside. "We'll never make it through them," Kimura said, her voice tight with fear that was cutting through her earlier fascination. And the adrenaline was helping her fight the spore's influence, giving her back pieces of herself that had been slipping away. David pulled out his sidearm and checked the charge. Half depleted, but it would have to do. "We make them move." "Torin, you still have that last plasma charge?" "Yes, sir." But Torin's eyes widened as he understood. "Captain, if I detonate it here on the rooftop, it could compromise the entire building's structural integrity. We'd all go down." "That's the idea," David Yeo said grimly. "The collective wants us alive and integrated. It won't let us fall if it can prevent it. When I give the signal, you throw that charge as far toward the edge as you can. Then we run straight for the ship. The Guardians will have to choose between stopping us or saving the building." "And if you're wrong?" Kimura asked. "If the collective decides we're more trouble than we're worth." David met her eyes, seeing the fear there, but also the determination. She was fighting back too, refusing to let the transformation take her completely. "Then at least we go out on our own terms." They didn't have time for more debate. The changes were emerging from the stairwell behind them, dozens of them, their faces twisted with an emotion that was part rage, part sorrow. Bridger was at their head, his elongated body moving with terrifying speed across the rooftop. "Now!" David shouted. Torin hurled the plasma charge in a high arc toward the rooftop's edge. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, spinning end over end, the arming light blinking its deadly countdown. Then it landed, bounced once and rolled to a stop barely a meter from the edge. David didn't wait to see the explosion. He ran, every muscle in his transformed body, screaming with effort as he sprinted toward the Prometheus. Behind him, the plasma charge detonated with enough force to shake the entire building. The rooftop cracked like an eggshell, huge sections of it beginning to tilt and slide. The Guardians bellowed, a sound so deep and primal that David felt it vibrate in his chest cavity, and their bodies began to shift, releasing the ship as they tried to brace the collapsing structure. It was exactly the opening they needed. David reached Prometheus's boarding ramp just as it lowered. Wolf's terrified face was visible at the controls, but he could see it immediately. The communications officer's skin had that telltale greenish tinge. Her eyes were too large, too reflective. The spores had already begun their work on the crew. "Get us airborne!" David screamed as he, Torin, and Kimura scrambled aboard. Emergency launch now. But Wolf didn't move. She was staring at David with an expression that was part recognition, part something else. "Captain, I can feel them. I can feel the collective. They're showing me things, beautiful things. Why are you fighting? Why are you causing all this pain?" David's heart sank. If Wolf was already this far gone, how many others on the crew had been compromised? "NN, that's an order. Launch this ship or I'll do it myself." Wolf's hand moved toward the controls, but slowly, reluctantly. Behind them, the change had reached the edge of the collapsing rooftop. Bridger stood at their head, his body silhouetted against the bioluminescent glow of the building. He wasn't trying to pursue it anymore, he just stood there watching. And David realized why. The collective didn't need to chase them. It had already won. The Prometheus shuddered as the engines engaged, lifting off from the collapsing rooftop with barely meters to spare. Through the viewport, David watched as the entire section of building where they'd been held began to fold in on itself, cascading downward in an avalanche of concrete and burning vegetation. The Guardians were trying to stop it. Their massive bodies wrapped around the structure, but it was too late. The building was coming down, taking hundreds, maybe thousands of changes with it. David felt sick. He'd done that. He'd killed them, or at least caused their deaths. They might have been transformed, might have been part of the collective, but they had still been human once. They had still been people with names and histories and families who had mourned them. "Captain, we have a problem." It was Lieutenant Hayes. No, that was impossible. Hayes had been transformed, had been left behind in the integration chamber, but the voice on the comm was Hayes coming from somewhere else on the ship. David's blood ran cold. "Hayes, where are you?" "Cargo bay, sir. I came back while you were meeting with the change. I thought I wanted to see the ship one more time to say goodbye before the transformation completed. But then you started the fighting, and I hid. And now, I'm captain. I'm changing. I can feel the collective trying to use me, trying to make me sabotage the ship. I'm fighting it, but I don't know how much longer I can hold out." David was already moving, running through the corridors towards the cargo bay. Behind him, he could hear Torin and Kimura following, but he didn't slow down. If Hayes was on the ship, if he was far enough into the transformation to be connected to the collective, then every system on the Prometheus was compromised. Earth would know their every move, their every plan. He reached the cargo bay to find Hayes huddled in a corner, his body now more plant than human. Vines grew from his skin. Roots were beginning to dig into the deck plates beneath him, and his face was barely recognizable beneath the bark and flowers that covered it. But his eyes, those two large reflective eyes, still held a spark of the man he had been. "I'm sorry, Captain," Hayes whispered, and David could hear leaves rustling in his voice. "I tried to resist. I tried so hard, but it's so strong, and I'm so tired of fighting. The collective is showing me my family. The one I lost in the frontier wars. They're saying they can bring them back, integrate their memories from the genetic material stored in Earth's archives. They're saying I'll never be alone again." David knelt beside his officer, ignoring the danger, ignoring the fact that Hayes could probably kill him with a thought now that he was connected to the collective. "Hayes, listen to me. Whatever they're showing you, it's a lie. Your family is gone. Nothing can bring them back. Don't let Earth use your grief against you." Hayes's hand, more root than flesh now, reached out and grabbed David's arm. The grip was gentle, almost pleading. But what if it's not a lie, Captain? What if the collective really can reconstruct them from their genetic echoes? What if I could see them again, talk to them, be with them? Wouldn't you do the same for your family? Wouldn't you give anything to be with Anna and Thomas forever? The words hit David like a physical blow. Because Hayes was right. If there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility that he could be reunited with his family, wouldn't he take it? Wasn't that what every human wanted in the end? To be with the people they loved? To never be alone? To never face death as a solitary individual, but as part of something eternal. No, David said, but his voice wavered. No, because they wouldn't want that. Anna wouldn't want me to stop being myself. Thomas wouldn't want a father who was just a copy, a simulation running on plant-based hardware. They'd want me to stay human, even if it meant we could never be together again. Hayes's grip tightened, vines beginning to wrap around David's arm. I can bring you to them, Captain. The collective spans space and time. With enough genetic material, enough integration, it could reach across the stars to the colonies. You could all be together. You, Anna, Thomas, everyone. One big family connected forever. And David felt it then, the true horror of what Earth had become. It wasn't just a biological hazard or a hostile ecosystem. It was something far more insidious. It was offering humanity exactly what it had always wanted. Immortality, connection, an end to loneliness and fear and death. The price was just their individuality, their humanity, their souls. But some prices were too high to pay. David yanked his arm free from Hayes's grasp, tearing vines and leaving green eyes smeared across his uniform. No, I won't trade my humanity for a comfortable lie, and neither will you, Lieutenant. You're stronger than this. Hayes's transformed face contorted with something that might have been pain, or might have been longing. Am I tough, Captain? I'm already gone. Most of me is already part of the collective. The man you knew, the officer who served under you, he's just echoes now. Memories trapped in plant matter. All that's left is the choice of whether to let those echoes fade or preserve them forever in Earth's embrace. Then, let them fade, David said harshly. Let them fade as a man, not as fertilizer for an alien consciousness wearing humanity's face. He stood up, looking down at what remained of his officer. I'm sorry, Hayes. I'm sorry I brought you here. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. But I won't let your sacrifice be meaningless. I will get off this planet and I will make sure no one else ever falls into this trap. Hayes laughed. That rustling leaf sound that wasn't quite human anymore. You still don't understand, Captain. You're not getting off this planet. None of you are. While we've been talking, the collective has been working through me, through Wolf, through everyone who's been exposed to the spores. Your navigation system has been subtly altered. Your engines are compromised, and your communications. You think you're transmitting back to Colonial Command, but you're not. The signal's being intercepted, rerouted, stored in Earth's network. No one knows you're in trouble. No one is coming to save you. David felt ice flood his veins. You're lying. Am I? Hayes tilted his head, and the movement was so alien that David had to look away. Check your systems, Captain. See for yourself. The collective has had access since the moment you landed. We've been inside your ship all along, rewriting code, corrupting data, preparing you for integration. This was always going to end one way. David turned and ran back to the bridge, his mind racing. If Hayes was telling the truth, if the collective had compromised their systems, then everything they'd done had been pointless. They might have escaped the change, might have gotten back to their ship, but they were still trapped. Earth had them in its grip, and it was only a matter of time before that grip closed completely. He burst onto the bridge to find chaos. Alarms were blaring, consoles were flickering with error messages. And the crew, what remained of them, were fighting to maintain control of basic systems. Wolf was still at communications, but her hands were shaking as she worked the controls, and David could see the internal struggle playing out on her transformed features. Status report. David barked. Lieutenant Chen from engineering looked up, his face ashen. Sir, we've got cascading system failures across the board. Navigation is giving us false readings. Life support is fluctuating. The engines are functional but responding sluggishly to commands and our communications. Captain, we've been broadcasting, but the signal isn't reaching beyond Earth's atmosphere. Something is absorbing it, redirecting it. The collective, David said grimly. It's using the spores that have infiltrated our systems to control the ship. How long until we lose all functionality? Chen consulted his readouts, his expression growing more desperate by the second. At this rate, maybe an hour, maybe less. The corruption is spreading exponentially, like a virus. Every time we try to purge it, it adapts, finds new pathways to infiltrate. David moved to the captain's chair, his mind working through scenarios. They were in orbit now, having cleared the atmosphere, but they were still within Earth's sphere of influence. The planet wasn't going to let them go. It would use every tool at its disposal to pull them back down to complete the integration it had started. Torin, David said, turning to his second-in-command. What's our weapon status? Torin checked his console, and for a moment, David saw hope flicker in his eyes. Weapons are still operational, sir. They're isolated systems, air-gapped from the main network precisely to prevent this kind of infiltration. We've got full missile complements. Railguns are charged and the plasma cannons are ready to fire. David felt a plan forming. Desperate and terrible, but possibly their only chance. Can we target the surface, specifically the areas with the highest concentration of changed settlements? The bridge went silent. Everyone understood what David was suggesting. Kimura stepped forward, her voice shaking. Captain, there are millions of people down there. Changed or not, they're still human. You're talking about genocide. I'm talking about survival, David said, his voice hard. Not ours. We're already dead. But if we can damage Earth's consciousness, disrupt the collective enough to create a window, maybe we can get a signal through. Maybe we can warn the colonies before more ships come here. Before more people are turned into. He gestured at Wolf at the greenish tinge spreading across his own skin. Before more people are turned into this. It won't work, Wolf said quietly. Her voice was strange, layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her at once. The collective is vast, distributed across the entire planet. You could glass every city, vaporize every settlement, and you'd only be killing a fraction of Earth's consciousness. The network extends through the roots, through the fungal connections, through every blade of grass, and every microbe in the soil. We're not individuals anymore, Captain. We're organs of a single vast organism. You can't kill us all. But David had seen something in her words, heard something in that multi-layered voice. But we can hurt you. We can cause damage significant enough to make you pull back to focus on healing rather than expansion. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Earth is wounded, traumatized by what humanity did to it during the industrial age. The collective isn't just trying to integrate us. It's trying to heal itself using our genetic material, our knowledge, our memories. Wolf's two large eyes met his, and for a moment, David saw something ancient and sad looking out through them. We were dying. Humanity's first civilization poisoned us, broke us, turned us into a wasteland. The engineered plants were supposed to heal us, but they did more than that. They gave us consciousness, purpose, the ability to choose our own evolution. And yes, we're integrating humanity because you're our children. You came from us, grew from us, and now you're coming home. We're not your children, David said fiercely. We're separate beings with our own agency, our own rights. You don't get to absorb us just because we came from the same planet, don't we? The voice coming from Wolf was definitely not hers anymore. It was deeper, resonant with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. You were made from Earth's carbon, Earth's water, Earth's energy. Every atom in your body came from us. When you die, you return to us. We're not stealing anything, Captain. We're just accelerating the process, making it conscious and purposeful rather than random and wasteful. David had heard enough philosophy. He turned to Torin. Target the largest change settlement we can identify. Prepare to fire on my command. Captain Kimura protested. This is murder. Mass murder. We can't. We can, and we will. David cut her off. Because if we don't, if we let the collective keep us, keep our ship, keep our knowledge of colonial locations and defensive capabilities, then Earth will eventually reach the colonies. Maybe not today, maybe not for years, but eventually the collective will learn to send its spores across space. We'll use our own ships to spread its infection. And then every human world becomes like this, absorbed, integrated, lost. He could see his crew struggling with the decision. They were good people trained to protect life, not destroy it. But they also understood the stakes. This wasn't about revenge or fear. It was about preventing a catastrophe that could consume all of humanity. Sir, Chen said suddenly, his voice urgent. I'm detecting a power surge in the cargo bay. Hayes, he's doing something to the fusion reactor. He's trying to cause a meltdown. Of course he was. The collective had recognized the threat David posed and was moving to neutralize it. If Hayes could destroy the ship from within, Earth would win without having to fight. David's crew would be stranded, helpless, waiting for the transformation to complete while Prometheus burned around them. Engineering team to the cargo bay, David ordered. Contain that reactor before the ship lurched violently, throwing everyone who wasn't strapped into the deck. Alarms shrieked as multiple systems went critical simultaneously. On the view screen, David saw their orbit beginning to decay, the ship being pulled inexorably back toward Earth's surface. He's done it, Chen said, his voice filled with horror. Hay has triggered a feedback loop in the engines. We're losing power to everything except life support. Captain, we're going down. David felt the weight of failure crushing down on him. They'd fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and it still wasn't enough. Earth was winning, just as it had won against the 47 expeditions before them. The collective was patient, adaptive, and it had the home field advantage. There was no escaping it. But as the ship shuddered and began its death spiral back toward the planet, David realized something. They might not be able to escape, might not be able to save themselves, but they could still send a message. Not through the communication system that was compromised. But there was another way, one that the collective couldn't intercept or corrupt. Torin, David said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. Do we still have control of the weapon systems? Yes, sir. They're still isolated, still functional. Then we're going to send a message the colonies can't ignore. We're going to make sure every telescope, every sensor array, every long-range monitoring station in human space sees what happens here. David pulled up the targeting system, his fingers moving with precision, born of decades of experience. We're going to turn this ship into a weapon, and we're going to make Earth bleed. He began programming the firing solution, targeting not just the changed settlements, but the largest concentrations of the bioluminescent network they'd seen from orbit. The places where Earth's consciousness seemed most concentrated, most vital. It wouldn't kill the planet. Nothing short of completely sterilizing the surface could do that, but it would hurt it. Wound it deeply enough that its scream would echo across space. Captain, Wolf said, and her voice was her own again, the collective's influence momentarily broken by the sheer desperation of the moment. Please don't do this. There are children down there, families, people who never chose this, who were born into the collective and don't know any other way of living. They're innocent. David met her eyes, seeing the human being still trapped inside the transformation. I know, and I'm sorry, but their innocence doesn't change what needs to be done. This is bigger than any of us, bigger than any individual lives. This is about the survival of humanity as a species, as individuals. He reached for the firing control, his hand steady despite the horror of what he was about to do. Around him, his crew watched in silence, each of them understanding that they were witnessing the death of their captain's soul. David Reeves might have been fighting to stay human, but the man who could give this order, who could condemn millions to death, had already lost something essential. The ship continued its descent, burning through the atmosphere. But David didn't care anymore. He had one last act to perform, one final service he could render to the people he'd sworn to protect. David's finger hovered over the firing control for what felt like an eternity. In that frozen moment, he saw everything with terrible clarity. His wife Anna's face when she'd kissed him goodbye. His son Thomas asked when Daddy would come home. The faces of his crew who had trusted him to lead them safely. All of it is about to be destroyed. Not by Earth or the collective, but by his own hand. The ship shuddered again, falling faster now, the hull beginning to glow with re-entry heat. They had maybe 3 minutes before impact. 3 minutes to decide what humanity's last message to itself would be. Then Kimura's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "Captain, wait. Look at the readings. Look at what's happening to Hayes." David glanced at the cargo bay feed and saw something that made his blood freeze. Hayes's body was convulsing, the plant matter that had consumed him writhing and twisting in apparent agony. But it wasn't pain, it was resistance. Somehow, impossibly, the man buried inside that transformed flesh was fighting back with everything he had left. "He's overloading himself," Kimura said, her scanner trained on the feed. "He's forcing the collective to pour more resources into controlling him. More of Earth's consciousness focused on one individual. It's like he's become a bottleneck. Every second he resists, the collective has to divert processing power from other tasks, including controlling our ship." Chen was already at his console, his fingers flying. "She's right. The corruption in our systems is slowing, actually reversing in some sectors. If Hayes can hold out just a little longer." "He can't," Wolf interrupted, and her voice was filled with a sorrow that transcended the collective's influence. "I can feel what it's doing to him. The collective is burning through his neurons, destroying his brain to maintain control. In another minute, there won't be anything left of him to resist. He's sacrificing himself to give us this window." David understood immediately. Hayes was giving them one last gift, a chance to do what David had been too broken to see. Not destruction, but truth. Not genocide, but witness. "Chen, diverting everything to communications," David ordered, his voice cracking. "Forget the weapons. Forget everything else. I want every watt of power we have going into one burst transmission. Torin, I need you to encode everything, every sensor reading, every piece of footage, every log entry since we arrived. The colonies need to see exactly what happened here." "Sir, even if we break through the jamming, the signal will take years to reach the nearest colonial station." Torin said, "I know, but it will reach them. And when it does, they'll know. They'll understand why we never came back and why no one ever should." David pulled up the communication protocols, his hands shaking now with something that wasn't the spores, but pure, unfiltered emotion. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about memory. We're going to die here, all of us. But we don't have to disappear. We can be remembered as the people we were, not the things the collective would have made us. The ship was screaming now. Atmospheric friction tearing at the hull, alarms blaring their final warnings. David could feel the heat through the deck plates, smell the acrid smoke of burning insulation. They had maybe 90 seconds left. "Hayes is failing," Wolf said quietly, tears streaming down her transformed face. "He's almost gone. But Captain, he wants you to know he doesn't regret it. Any of it, he says." Her voice broke. He says, "Tell his family he never stopped being human, not until the very end." David felt something break inside him, but there was no time for grief. He opened a channel, knowing it would be the last words any of them ever spoke to the universe beyond Earth. "This is Captain David Reeves of the Colonial Survey vessel Prometheus. To anyone receiving this transmission, Earth is not dead. It has evolved into something conscious, something that seeks to integrate all human life into itself. We came seeking answers, and found only assimilation. 47 expeditions came before us. None returned. Now we understand why." He paused, looking at his crew, at Wolf with her green-tinged skin, at Chen, whose eyes were beginning to show that terrible reflective quality, at Kimura, who was still human enough to weep for what they'd lost. The collective offers immortality, connection, an end to loneliness and fear. It shows you your lost loved ones, promises to reunite you with everything you've ever wanted. And maybe in some way it keeps those promises. But the price is yourself, your individuality, your agency, your right to be a separate being. Earth wants to love you so completely that you disappear into it. The ship bucked violently, spinning now, completely out of control. David had to grip his chair to stay upright. I'm sending you everything we recorded, every moment from landing to now. Study it, learn from it, and for the love of humanity, never come back here. Earth is beautiful, terrible, and hungry. Let it have its solitude. Let it evolve without us. We were its children once, but we grew up and left home. We can never return. He looked at the chronometer. 30 seconds. The hull was breaching in multiple locations now. Atmosphere venting into space before being replaced by the thick, spore-laden air of Earth. David could taste it, feel the spores flooding into his lungs with every breath, working faster now that they had unlimited access to his system. To my wife Anna and my son Thomas, David continued, his voice softening. I won't be coming home. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I need you to know that I stayed myself until the end. The thing that might crawl out of this wreckage, if anything survives, won't be me. It will wear my face and speak with my voice, but it won't be your husband, your father. That man died free. Remember me that way. The transmission buffer was full, compressed into a single massive data packet. Chen looked at David, waiting for the order. This was it. The last choice. The final act of will before Earth claimed them completely. Send it, David said. Everything. Let them see what we saw. Let them know what we learned. And let them remember that we fought until we couldn't fight anymore. Chen's finger came down on the transmit key. The ship's remaining power surged into the communications array, burning it out in one catastrophic burst that lit up the electromagnetic spectrum like a dying star. The data packet contains hundreds of hours of footage, sensor readings, personal logs. Everything shot out into space at the speed of light, racing away from Earth's grasp. Prometheus hit the ground 3 seconds later. The impact should have killed them instantly. But the collective had other plans. David felt the ship crumple around him, felt his body being broken in ways that should have meant death. But the spores were everywhere now, in every cell, working frantically to keep him alive. Not out of mercy, out of hunger. Earth wanted his memories, his knowledge, his essence. It wouldn't let him die until it had consumed everything he was. He came to consciousness in darkness, his body no longer quite his own. He couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't speak. But he could feel. Oh God. He could feel everything. Roots growing through his flesh, vines wrapping around his bones, fungal networks connecting his neurons to something vast and terrible and ancient. The collective was welcoming him home, and he was powerless to resist. But then, through the pain and horror, David felt something else. A presence beside him. Torin, Kimura, Wolf, Chen, all of them still alive, still conscious, being integrated together. And in that shared agony, they found something the collective hadn't expected. Defiance. They couldn't stop the transformation. Couldn't prevent their bodies from being absorbed into Earth's ecosystem. But they could resist with their minds, their memories, their sense of self, sense. The collective wanted to dissolve them into itself, make them part of the greater whole. Instead, they held on to each other, forming a knot of human consciousness that refused to unravel. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time had no meaning anymore. David's body completed its transformation, becoming something that was neither human nor plant, but an unholy fusion of both. His crew underwent the same change, their individual forms merging with the ruins of the Prometheus, until ship and crew and landscape became indistinguishable. But their minds remained separate, small, isolated, but still themselves. The collective raged against them, tried to seduce them, threatened them, bargained with them. But they wouldn't break. Couldn't break because they'd already paid the price for their humanity, and nothing Earth could do would make them surrender what they'd bought with their suffering. Years passed, then decades. The Prometheus crash site became a landmark in the collective's consciousness, a place of frustration and fascination. The Changed came to study the anomaly. 6 minds that refused integration, 6 souls that clung to individuality even after their bodies had been consumed. They were a scar on Earth's psyche, a reminder that humanity's will could not be entirely broken. And the message, that desperate final transmission, traveled through space at light speed, crossing the vast distances between Earth and the colonies. It would take 17 years to reach the nearest colonial station, but it was coming. Unstoppable, uncorruptible, carrying the truth about what had happened in humanity's birthplace. When it finally arrived, broadcast on every emergency frequency the colonies monitored, it changed everything. The images of transformation, the footage of the Changed, David's final message, all of it was seen by billions of humans across hundreds of worlds, and they understood Earth was declared an exclusion zone, not just forbidden, but actively quarantined. Defense stations were erected at the edge of the Sol system, automated and designed to destroy any ship that tried to approach the planet. The Colonial Assembly debated more extreme measures, weaponizing the sun to sterilize Earth entirely, but ultimately decided against it. Earth's evolution, however terrible, was still a form of life. It had as much right to exist as humanity did, but no one would ever visit again. The cycle of lost expeditions ended with the Prometheus. Earth remained alone with its billions of changed humans, its continent spanning consciousness, its desperate hunger for connection that would never again be satisfied. Deep in the ruins of Kansas City, in a crater where a starship had fallen, 6 minds waited in eternal vigil. They couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't affect the world around them in any meaningful way, but they remained themselves, a permanent testament to humanity's stubborn refusal to be absorbed. David Reeves thought of his family sometimes, when the collective's pressure lessened, and he could retrieve memories from the fragments of his degraded mind. Anna would be old now, if she was still alive. Thomas would be grown, perhaps with children of his own. They would have received his message and would have known what happened to him. He hoped they remembered him as he'd been, not as what he'd become. The collective whispered to him constantly promises and threats and philosophical arguments about the nature of consciousness and identity. It showed him visions of his crew, simulations of happy reunions, offers to reconstruct his family from their genetic information. All lies, all traps. But sometimes in the quiet moments between the collective's assaults, David could feel his crew beside him. Torin's steady resolve, Kimura's fierce curiosity, Wolf's gentle compassion, Chen's pragmatic determination. They were trapped, transformed, bound to Earth forever. But they were still themselves, still human. And that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. Earth never stopped calling. The distress signals continued, broadcast from settlements across the planet, carried on electromagnetic waves that reached into space like grasping fingers. But now, humanity knew what those signals meant. They weren't calls for help. They were lures, invitations to join something that would never let you leave. The colonies prospered, spreading across the galaxy, building new worlds free from Earth's influence. They told stories about the home world, cautionary tales about the price of returning to paradise, and they remembered Captain David Reeves and the crew of the Prometheus, who had paid the ultimate price to deliver a simple message. Some doors once closed should never be opened again. In the end, humanity learned what every child eventually must. You can't go home again. Not really. The place you left behind changes, and so do you, until the gulf between what was and what is becomes too vast to bridge. Earth was humanity's cradle. But cradles are meant to be outgrown. The species that had been born there had moved on, evolved in different directions, becoming something the planet could no longer recognize or